My name is Brad McKinnon. I'm a professor of history at Heritage Christian University in Florence, Alabama. I'm a middle-aged white man with dark brown hair sprinkled with gray. I wear glasses and have a beard. I'm wearing a gray sport coat, a light blue shirt, and a blue and red striped tie. I live and work just a few miles from Ivy Green, Helen Keller's birthplace and childhood home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Today, the National Historic Landmark and Museum receives thousands of visitors annually. Tuscumbia is also home to the Helen Keller Public Library and the Helen Keller Hospital. In June, the Helen Keller Festival of the Arts features a parade, concerts, film screenings, and crafts. The annual presentation of William Gibson's play The Miracle Worker is a much anticipated summer event on the grounds at Ivy Green, and Christmas at Ivy Green is celebrated each December. In this community, a sort of civil religion surrounds Keller's legacy and her Alabama roots. She is presented as a bulwark for the values of hard work, determination, and individual responsibility. These values are undergirded by public rituals, symbols, and sacred spaces that offer the community a powerful, if not mythic, image of Keller. On April 5, 1887, young Helen Keller experienced a life-changing moment. That spring afternoon, her teacher, Ann Mansfield Sullivan, led her to the water pump outside the house. Keller had been struggling with distinguishing the finger-spelled terms water and mug, confusing the container for the contents. As water from the pump poured over Keller's hand, Sullivan again spelled the word water in the other using the manual alphabet. At that moment, Keller began connecting words with their corresponding objects, which in turn opened a world of language for her. In tribute to her teacher, Keller would describe this moment as like the first effects of the warm beams that start melting of winter snow, flake by flake, a patch here and another there. Keller later called Sullivan's arrival from Boston a month earlier, on March 3, 1887, her spiritual birthday. As we reflect on the anniversary of this moment and Keller's subsequent life of nearly 88 years, I'm honored to participate in this virtual event series, Be Love, sponsored by the Helen Keller Spiritual Life Collaborative. Helen Keller was raised in a traditional Protestant home, her father a Presbyterian and her mother an Episcopalian. However, because Keller's parents did not attempt to provide any religious education for her due to the communication difficulties they faced, Keller was viewed as a tabula rasa when it came to her theological understanding. Keller's first introduction to religious instruction came around the age of 9 from a relative Keller would describe later as a good aunt. Keller found it difficult to accept her aunt's explanations about the omnipresence of God, the Trinity, and the notion that humans were originally created out of dust. I am made of flesh and blood and bones, and I was born nearly 9 years ago, young Helen objected. But even more, Keller questioned the congruity of eternal condemnation with the God whom Christ declared to be love. These early misgivings foreshadowed the lifelong conflict Keller perceived between her theological intuition and what she considered the shortcomings of Orthodox religion. As Keller's early intellectual guardian, Anne Sullivan sought to delay Keller's growing curiosity. When you are older and can understand what your aunt told you, you will read and learn much about God and His world, she promised. After Keller moved to Boston in the summer of 1888, Sullivan, herself an agnostic, felt it best to help young Keller make sense of her burgeoning theological mind by introducing her to Phillips Brooks, the well-known rector and minister at Trinity Church. Some 20 years earlier, Brooks had garnered national notoriety for his sermon in Philadelphia on April 23, 1865, titled, The Life and Death of Abraham Lincoln, and for his prayer that July at Harvard's Commemoration Day in honor of the institution's Civil War dead. Just over a week after Lincoln's assassination, Brooks described 2 American characters, one based on a new way for a new world, the other a feudalistic society more suited for the old one. One spirit was based on the influence of freedom, while the other was full of the influences of slavery, an institution Brooks called the horrible sacrament. At the time of the Harvard commemoration, Brooks was a relatively unknown figure. However, as the ceremony began, And attendees believed Brooks had eclipsed fellow notable speakers, including New England dignitaries Julia Ward Howe, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and James Russell Lowell. William Reed Huntington, the rector of Grace Church in New York, recalled, "There went forth from his lips a fiery stream of thanksgiving and supplication, the like of which I never knew." In addition, Charles W. Eliot, who would be named president of Harvard in 1869, although not present at the commemoration, announced that a young prophet had risen up in Israel. Colonel Henry Lee, alumni chief marshal for the event, reflected on Brooks's invocation decades later. "On that day, words seemed powerless. They did not vent the overflowing sympathy and gratitude all felt," he remembered. But in the exercises came a prayer, a brief prayer of a few minutes, of one inspired to pour forth the thanksgiving of the assembled brethren. Lee concluded, "From that moment, the name of that inspired young man, till then unknown, became a household word." Adopting a tolerant, ecumenical approach, Brooks would become one of the most respected and influential preachers of America's Gilded Age. Brooks' broad church theology and his optimistic humanism that prioritized good works over dogma proved a useful theological match for Keller's early religious sensibilities. From early childhood to adulthood, Keller consistently valued human activity as a source of theological fulfillment. Just like God had created in the past and had brought light into the world, the divine continued to disperse darkness through commitment of individuals to practical service. Today it is as in the beginning. Darkness is upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God is moving upon the face of the waters, she wrote in her mid-50s. Keller's theological humanism influenced her commitment to practical social change. In time, the light shall shine more and more into a true Easter, and in that light we shall behold a heaven upon earth civilization, she journaled from Kansas City in the spring of 1937. Brooks's interaction with the young Keller was welcoming, gentle, and non-dogmatic. The correspondence focused on God, religion, and one's obligation to others. In an exchange about personal happiness, Brooks wrote, "God does not only want us to be happy, he wants us to be good." He continued, "He knows that we can be really happy only when we are good." Happiness was not just a state associated with pleasure or contentment. For Brooks, happiness may even manifest itself through suffering for a righteous cause. In the same correspondence, Brooks explained, "And so love is everything. And if anybody asks you, or if you ask yourself what God is, answer, God is love." That is the beautiful answer which the Bible gives. Inspired by Brooks, Keller's concept of happiness matured through the years, as she would come to see happiness or joy not as a goal achieved through selfish ambition, but through fidelity to a worthy purpose, a life that would not only consume happiness, but produce it. During a lecture at Yale Divinity School in 1877, Brooks had encouraged seminarians to never be afraid to bring the transcendent mysteries of our faith, Christ's life and death and resurrection, to the help of the humblest and commonest of human wants. He warned students to avoid the tendency to preach about Christianity, but instead asked them to try to preach Christ. Brooks's more inclusive brand of Christianity delighted Keller. Throughout her life, Keller gravitated toward Brooks's approach to religion, which emphasized love and good works. For Brooks, the power of love in the human heart revealed God. His view of Christian ministry had permanently informed Keller's growing sense of social responsibility. Keller concluded, "I have found no creed or system more soul-satisfying than Bishop Brooks's creed of love." This introduction initiated Keller's lifelong quest for a functional faith. In 1894, John Hitz, a retired Swiss diplomat and colleague of Alexander Graham Bell, presented 13-year-old Keller with a Braille copy of Emanuel Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell. Carefully tracing her fingers across the series of raised dots, she felt that for the first time immortality put on intelligibility, and the earth wore new curves of loveliness and significance. Over the next several years, Keller would gradually commit herself to the religion of the new church. From the age of 16, she considered herself a Swedenborgian and maintained adherence to Swedenborg's teachings until she died in 1968. She felt this newfound faith had opened her eyes to all that was beautiful and noble. Keller's desire for useful service, inspired by Brooks, well fit Swedenborgian theology. According to Swedenborg, heaven had three levels: central, intermediate, and outer. It was one's inner nature that determined eternal destiny, with the central heaven reserved for those who acted on their best intentions using their divine gifts. Keller was comforted by these Swedenborgian concepts. Understanding was not dependent on physical abilities or the mere accumulation of facts. True knowledge was based on beauty, love, and lofty, delicate sentiments. This knowledge did not require perfect sight or hearing, but faith that a world unspeakably more complete and beautiful than the material world was possible. Swedenborg's writings challenged Keller to act in this world on the best of heaven's intentions. Keller's perspective on social responsibility was based on Swedenborg's notion of love of use or service to others. Active love could free people from seeing themselves as the victims of the whimsy of fate. Instead, everyone had the potential to practice the highest of all arts, the art of living. Keller considered Swedenborg central to this spiritual journey. She documented her growing devotion to the writings of Swedenborg and her commitment to the mission of the new church in My Religion. Keller began to distinguish dogma from theology and Christian practice. I was not religious in the sense of practicing ritual, Keller claimed, but happy because I saw God altogether lovely after the shadows cast upon his image by the harsh creeds of warring sects and religions. Keller's optimism derived inspiration from a Swedenborgian emphasis on biblical and natural symbolism as evidence of a more pleasant reality. In her 1903 essay titled Optimism, Keller wrote, "The history of man is an epic of progress. In the world within and the world without, I see a wonderful correspondence, a glorious symbolism which reveals the human and the divine communing together. The lesson of philosophy repeated in fact." She was convinced of the progress of modern life, acknowledging the decrease in crime, the development of affordable housing for working class families, employer awareness of the necessity of a living wage, and the recognition of the right to a quality education. If we compare our time with the past, we find in modern statistics a solid foundation for a confident and buoyant world optimism, she observed. These social improvements were indications of an awakened and enlightened public conscience. Just like Swedenborg separated the literal meaning from the spiritual meaning of Scripture, Keller separated the notion of human efforts at religion from the concept of a divine faith. An emphasis on humanity's shortcomings would produce negativity. However, faith based on God's actions would lead to confidence in a brighter future. To ask for religion without faith, she argued, is like asking for the flower without the seed. Keller surmised that religion may perhaps be man's despair in not finding God, while faith is hope, God searching for man. Keller's desire for a practical faith found a comfortable home within Swedenborgianism. Her commitment to an active faith, and not just a confessional one, was manifested by her intense desire to transform her aspirations into reality. Swedenborg envisioned a commonwealth built upon goodness and truth. Goodness is the inward being of life, and truth is the outward manifestation of it, he argued. The result would be what Jesus had called in the gospel the greatest commandment, to love God, and the second one like it, loving one's neighbor as yourself. Swedenborg defined the importance of civic engagement in terms of what he called the maximus homo, grand man, or universal humanity. For Swedenborg, God was infinite. There is one human God who is the source of everything, and all things depend on a single God, he argued. But this infinite God was also an embodied person. Swedenborg claimed this divine person enjoyed everything that having a body entails. The sensual nature of deity would have been well received by Keller. Especially provocative was Swedenborg's notion that God had sense organs as we know them: eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and tongue. While problematic and indicative of a received ableism, the divine with perfect senses left Keller with the hope of restoring her own senses of sight and hearing, as well as developing the ability to speak perfectly. For Keller, her outward world of silence and darkness concealed an inward world of music and brightness and color flashes that could be revealed in the divine presence. Swedenborg's universal humanity, by definition, emphasized the collective over the individual. He envisioned people acting in mutual love, functioning together as one unified body. Thus, Swedenborg's theology was rooted in free thinking and an active faith that would result in the reimagining of human society into a commonwealth, personified by faith in a universal humanity. This divine universal entity was composed of two essences: wisdom and love. Love served as the motivating factor, and wisdom represented practical application. Everything we deal with that is civic, everything moral, and everything spiritual depends on these two things, Swedenborg argued. For Swedenborg, the divine essence was good and true. Goodness corresponded to love, and what was true corresponded to wisdom. Good feelings were associated with God's love, while appropriate thoughts were associated with God's wisdom. These two characteristics bound the universe together. Love finds its reality in wisdom, and wisdom finds its manifestation in love. As Swedenborg's grand man was made of two essences, in much the same way Swedenborg conceived of human society divided into three true elements: civic, moral, and spiritual. He sought to transform culture, not only through rational knowledge, but also through philanthropic action. We need to realize, Swedenborg urged, that our rational ability is not formed and opened simply by virtue of our knowing these truths, but by virtue of our living by them. He recognized individuals, communities, nations, and churches as his neighbor, and he defined loving neighbor as helping them from a love for their good in keeping with their state. Therefore, life in God's kingdom was not based on carnal love, grounded in selfish motives of prestige, position, and profit. Instead, moral, civic, and religious life should be based on loving what is good and honest and fair for its own sake. Keller was inspired by this sense of civic responsibility advocated by Swedenborg. Influenced by Swedenborg's commitment to civic, moral, and spiritual good, Keller emphasized practical piety. The biblical text, unfiltered by sectarian interpretations, had brought joy into Keller's life, developed a deeper appreciation for others, and made sense of what she called the hours of struggle and solitude. Swedenborg had inspired high dreams, held dearer than the baits of ease and complacence. Keller was determined to overcome what Swedenborg believed was a selfish tendency in each person. Our own nature is to love ourselves more than God, and the world more than heaven, and to regard the neighbor as nothing in comparison to ourselves, Swedenborg had observed. He believed people were born competing against twin evils: love for oneself and for the world. Swedenborg's theology gave Keller an opportunity to live a life inspired by service to others. This process began with a more complete understanding of her own self-worth. Swedenborg's books have lifted my wistful longing for a fuller sense life into a vivid consciousness of the complete being within me, she contemplated. The prospect of personal agency, in turn, gave her faith in a future where self-expression was undergirded not by selfish conceit, but by commitment to a shared community. She considered herself part of a celestial community that promoted peaceful associations and active service. There, blessed figures, arrayed in light, pass me and smile companionship with me. Their beautiful hands guide me in the paths of peace, and they whisper patience to me, Keller imagined. In God's presence, Keller looked forward to speaking, creating, and working in ways much more fitting and beautiful than possible in earthly life. Keller anticipated a communal experience in the other life, everyone loving and learning together. Every thought and every utterance had an interested listener. Every creative impulse had a fitting application. Every life had an adventure. Keller's attraction to radical social and political movements, guided by her Swedenborgian faith, would at times be complicated by her own relatively privileged status. On the one hand, she typically expressed ardently progressive views. We invent more and more horrible weapons to kill and mar our brothers and sisters in war. We mutilate helpless animals for sport or for the changing whims of fashion. And we have a passion for fault finding and scandal that rises beyond control, she lamented. However, on the other hand, she advocated for self help and overcoming obstacles with one's grit and fortitude. Yes, she felt fellowship with those who sought to challenge the world as they had received it. After all, Keller herself had written an essay titled How I Would Help the World. However, she believed such attention could be overemphasized and often wrongly applied. Instead, Keller consistently valued self determination. The blind, the deaf, the prisoner for conscience sake, even the poorest men and women with sound ideals have all proved that they can shape life nearer to their desires, no matter what the outward circumstance. While Keller did not oppose public activism, she emphasized personal characteristics as more determinative than the environment. It is not environment that alters a human being, but forces within the individual, she declared. Now, I am as much up in arms against needless poverty and degrading influences as anyone else, but at the same time, I believe human experience teaches that if we cannot succeed in our present position, we could not succeed in any other, she argued. Of first importance was personal character, shaped by positive thoughts and ideals. However, only when individuals recognized the divine could the common good overshadow all lesser ends. Based on her understanding of Swedenborg, heavenly life was a truly human life, and there are all kinds of service, domestic, civil, social, and inspirational, to be performed and enjoyed. A world filled with active goodwill and cooperation could replace hatred, violence, and war. There was a direct link between her faith and optimistic dreams for a renewed society. These dreams would soon find practical application as she began challenging the ignorance, poverty, and the unconscious cruelty of the world around her. Despite her inconsistencies in balancing personal responsibility and civic activism, Keller's public faith would manifest itself in the years to come through her devotion to radical political, economic, and social ideologies. In response to a critic, Keller defined the essence of Christianity as the supreme and equal worth of each individual. Thus, she saw herself as an ally for the enslaved, the injured, and the oppressed of the earth. She concluded, there is no peace between the teachings of Christ and any form of slavery. Keller believed social obligations, inspired by Swedenborg, represented the pinnacle of human existence. The perfection of man is the love of use or service to others. Our groping acts are mere stammering suggestions of the higher self that we long to be, Keller declared. Swedenborg's universal theology had animated Keller's ideas of love, truth, and usefulness. Humanity's attributes of rational thought and free will were manifestations of the image of God. No, what makes a person human is the ability to think and will as a human, and therefore to receive attributes that are divine or the Lord's, Swedenborg wrote in Secrets of Heaven. To be human was not merely individual existence, but participation in community. Thus, each person had the responsibility to work in harmony with others. Swedenborg envisioned people acting in mutual love, functioning together as one unified body. This theology valued free thinking and an active faith that would reimagine human society. And Keller shared these values. The divine presence could be experienced now through a commitment to service motivated by love. She professed, I believe that life is given us so we may grow in love. And I believe that God is in me as the sun is in the color and fragrance of the flower, the light in my darkness, the voice in my silence. In May 1919, Keller spoke at the General Convention of the Church of the New Jerusalem at the National Swedenborgian Church in Washington, D.C. Known colloquially as the Victory Convention, the gathering was held just months after the armistice of November 11, 1918, ending hostilities on the war's Western Front. Keller was welcomed with flowers, music, hymns, and familial affection. Reflecting on this event a decade later, Keller focused on the Swedenborgian fellowship that had enlivened her soul for nearly 3 decades. Thinking of those she called her Swedenborgian friends, she wrote, "There are radiant moments when I feel the beams of spiritual kinship that occasionally shine upon the yearning soul." During her speech, Keller's mind gravitated toward the juxtaposition of happiness and immortality with sorrow and death that had framed her life's philosophy. It is fitting that in the resurrection time of the year we should turn our minds to the thoughts of a happy immortality, she began. But as she reflected on the years of devastating war, she was also struck by the pervasiveness of earthly suffering. Never before in the history of the world have so many people faced death at the same time and felt the depths and heights of a universal sorrow, she mourned. Keller believed it was incumbent on readers of Swedenborg, such as herself, to offer hope to the world. If it has been given to any of us to behold in vision the glories of the heavenly land, it is evidently our duty to try to hold up the souls of our fellow men with the message of the life to come, she urged. Keller had found comfort in Swedenborg's message and desired to offer that same consolation to others in distress. This message of comfort offered a clear vision of the life of the soul. Swedenborg had awakened his readers to spiritual life in much the same way the earth experiences new beauty every spring. To nations tearing each other apart, Swedenborg offered a blessed haven of refuge. His teachings were sensible and rational in a world of hate and ignorance. This faith was incarnational. Keller and other readers of Swedenborg were responsible for engaging the world as it was to help make it what it could be. In turn, this principle served as a bridge between her theological life and her commitment to the social reconstruction of society. In the final chapter of Out of the Dark, Keller detailed her developing theological understandings as a young adult. She outlined characteristics of the kind of religion that she would find attractive her whole life, a universal religion of love focused on God as a parent and each person a brother or sister. Interestingly, Keller attributes this burgeoning theology almost exclusively to Phillips Brooks. After describing her extensive interactions with Brooks, she acknowledged that after his death, she had read some philosophical works on religion, among them Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell. She concluded, "I have found no creed or system more soul-satisfying than Bishop Brooks's creed of love." Keller felt there was little difference between Swedenborgian theology and the instruction she received from Brooks. "I was not conscious of any difference between what Mr. Brooks taught me and what I read in Swedenborg," Keller claimed. This declaration was likely influenced by the ecumenical lens through which she viewed religion in general and Christianity in particular. Keller's consignment of Swedenborg to the margins of her theological development also underscores a consistent characteristic of Keller's personality, namely the attachment to people, places, or ideas that represent her first introduction to concepts. In addition, Swedenborgianism's traditional commitment to a benign ecumenism tended to cause the fellowship to be overlooked within Protestant Christianity at large. Keller's theology is an evolving story. Her introduction to Swedenborg in 1894 corresponds neatly with Brooks's death in 1893, and Keller biographer Joseph Lash links these theological moorings to American psychologist William James' Religion of Healthy Mindedness, which prioritized religion's capacity to bring mental and physical health to the believer. Certainly, Keller did not immediately or intuitively recognize distinctions between Brooks's liberal Protestantism and Swedenborg's mystical idealism. As I read Heaven and Hell, I felt God as close to me as when Bishop Brooks and I talked about Christ, Keller claimed. However, Brooks did not emphasize these differences either. He saw much in Swedenborg's reputation and in his theology to celebrate. I have the profoundest honor for the character and work of Emanuel Swedenborg, he noted. I have from time to time gained much from his writings. It is impossible to say a little on so great a theme. Yes, in a true sense, we are all new churchmen, with new light, new hopes, and new communion with God in Christ. Inspired by Brooks and Swedenborg, Keller's faith in a community free from fear and grounded in love for God and neighbor was here and now. Keller's example is more important now than ever. I hope the values we celebrate this week inspire you to foster love, service, and community in your own contexts.